You have to highlight the screen.
Sorry, Valuable?
You have to highlight the screen.
Yes, it's pinned, I think. So, welcome everyone to our fourth session this morning. We are reading and studying about Buddhist Introduction to Buddhist Philosophy and Meditation. We are so happy to welcome back Venerable Gyalten Lekten, and it's really hard for teachers of our center who are actually students studying Buddhist philosophy and psychology at Seraje Monastic University to take time and come here. So this is really a wonderful opportunity for us to learn from them. And thank you so much for coming and spending time every weekend with us. And I hope you all enjoy the teachings.
Thank you. Indeed. I won't say it's really, think of what I think it's okay. Yeah, we can do that. If you think about how difficult it was to hear teachings back in Tibet 100 years ago, never mind in Tibet, anywhere, before you had the modes of transport we have and everything, that, taking a bus ride for a few hours, coming here, so taking a few days off from classes isn't that difficult. So I appreciate these things. It's very difficult for us. It's a disturbance to our schedule. We're very fortunate to be able to come together in this way, Before, in Tibet, you would just have to wait until there was a Lama or a monk coming through your village who you might go attend teachings with. So when they come or don't come, you don't know. And then if you really wanted to travel to visit a teaching, you'd have to get on a yak and go for hours and hours and hours or days even, So we're very fortunate. And the Karnataka buses aren't that bad, so it's okay.
You're being very generous. Thank you.
So thank you all for coming today. I appreciate you spending time. Let's take a moment to get ourselves situated in the space, whether that's the space here or those of us who are joining us digitally. Take a moment to let all of the worldly experiences be put outside. Whatever was happening in your lives this morning as you prepared to come here, we'll set those aside for the moment so we can focus on this practice of study and contemplation. So we want to create what we think of as a sacred space for our engaging with the Dharma. And as I often say, eventually we want this distinction between our worldly life and our sacred or spiritual life to be non-existent, that distinction. But we do that by actively cultivating a space that is mindful, that is spiritual, that is a space where we engage in study and practice. And as we build up that practice, we let that space expand, right? So let's actively cultivate that space right now. And let's set a very strong motivation that we've come together this morning to explore Buddhist philosophy and meditation, not for our own benefit alone, not just so that we might have some peace in our lives, but so that we might develop the wisdom and the skill to be a benefit to others in this life and in all future lives. Recognize that the main goal of my life is to be of service to others in whatever ways I am able to do so. By dedicating myself to others, that is how I will be free from my own suffering, and that is how I will make the most meaning of my life. And so today we'll study and we will meditate together with this motivation in mind, that we're here so we can benefit others. And so to help secure that motivation, we'll recite a few prayers in the Gold Prayer Book. Let's turn to page 34. We'll recite the Refuge and Bodhicitta prayer 3 times in Tibetan and once in English. Then we'll recite the other prayers on those pages, the 4 immeasurable thoughts, the 7-limb prayer, and a short mandala offering. We'll recite all of those in English. Sangye Shiran Soki Shonam La Jangju Paru Dagni Kapsu Shi Dagi Hinsogi Pe Sonam Gi Vyola Penche Sangye Dril Paya Sho Sangye Shiran Soki Shonam La Jangju Paru Dagni Kapsu Shi Dagi Hinsogi Pe Sonam Gi Vyola Penche Sangye Dril Paya Sho Sangye Kiran Soki Shonam La Janto Pardo Dagni Gabsuji Tagi Linzongi Be Sonangi Drola Pencher Sange Lupar Hyok. I go for refuge until I'm enlightened, the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Supreme Assembly. By my practice of giving and other perfections, may I become a Buddha to benefit all sentient beings. May all sentient beings have happiness and the causes of happiness. May all sentient beings be free from suffering and the causes of suffering. May all sentient beings be inseparable from the happiness that is free from suffering. May all sentient beings abide in equanimity, free from attachment for friends and hatred for enemies. May all sentient beings have happiness and the causes of happiness. May all sentient beings be free from suffering and the causes of suffering. May all sentient beings be inseparable from the happiness that is free from suffering. May all sentient beings abide in equanimity, free from attachment for friends and hatred for enemies. May all sentient beings have happiness and the causes of happiness. May all sentient beings be free from suffering and the causes of suffering. May all sentient beings be inseparable from the happiness that is free from suffering. May all sentient beings abide in equanimity, free from attachment for friends and hatred for enemies. Reverently, I prostrate with my body, speech, and mind. I present clouds of every type of offering, actual and imagined. I declare all my negative actions accumulated since beginning this time and rejoice in the merit of all ordinary and holy beings. Please remain until the end of cyclic existence and turn the wheel of Dharma for living beings. I dedicate my own merits and those of all others to the great enlightenment. This ground, anointed with perfumes, strewn with flowers, adorned with Mount Meru, 4 continents, the sun and the moon. I imagine this as a Buddha field and offer it. May all living beings enjoy this pure land. Idam Purana Mandala Kamyayakayami. And let's offer the praise to Shakyamuni Buddha, which is on page 73. To the founder, the endowed, transcendent destroyer, the one gone beyond, the foe destroyer, the completely perfected, fully awakened being, perfect in knowledge and in good conduct, Sugata, knower of the world, supreme guide of human beings to be tamed, teacher of gods and human beings. To you, the completely and fully awakened one, the endowed, transcendent destroyer, the glorious conqueror, the subduer from the Shakya clan, I prostrate, make offerings, and go for refuge. To the founder, the endowed, transcendent destroyer, the one gone beyond, the foe destroyer, the completely perfected, fully awakened being, perfect in knowledge and in good conduct, Sugata, knower of the world, supreme guide of human beings to be tamed, teacher of gods to human beings, to you, the completely and fully awakened one, the endowed, transcendent destroyer, the glorious conqueror, the subduer from the Shakya clan, I prostrate, make offerings, and go for refuge. To the founder, the endowed, transcendent destroyer, the one gone beyond, the foe destroyer, the completely perfected, fully awakened being, perfect in knowledge and in good conduct, Sugata, knower of the world, supreme guide of human beings to be tamed, teacher of gods and human beings, to you, the completely and fully awakened one, the endowed, transcendent destroyer, the glorious conqueror, the subduer from the Shakya clan, I prostrate, make offerings, and go for refuge. When, O supreme among humans, you were born on this earth, you paced out 7 strides, and then said, I am supreme in this world. To you, who are wise then, I prostrate. With pure bodies, formed supremely pure, wisdom ocean like a golden mountain, fame that blazes in the 3 worlds, winner of the best, Lord, to you I prostrate. With the supreme signs, face like spotless moon, color like gold, to you I prostrate. Dust free like you, the 3 worlds are not. Incomparably wise one, to you I prostrate. The Savior having great compassion, the Founder having all understanding, the field of merit with qualities like a vast ocean, to you, the one gone to thusness, I prostrate. The purity that frees one from attachment, the virtue that frees one from the lower realms, the one path, the sublime pure reality, to the Dharma that pacifies, I prostrate. Those who are liberated and who also show the path to liberation, the holy field qualified with realizations who are devoted to the moral precepts, to you, the sublime community intending virtue, I prostrate. Homage to the Supreme Buddha, homage to the Dharma refuge, homage to the great Sangha, to all three, ever devout homage. To all worthy of respect, bound with bodies as many as all realms, atoms, in all aspects. With supreme faith, I pay homage. Do not commit any non-virtuous actions. Perform only perfect virtuous actions. Subdue your mind thoroughly. This is the teaching of the Buddha. A star, a visual aberration, a flame of a lamp, an illusion, a drop of dew or a bubble, a dream, a flash of lightning, a cloud. See conditioned things as such. Through these merits may sentient beings attain the rank of all seeing, subdue the foe of faults, and be delivered from samsara's ocean, perturbed by the ways of aging, sickness, and death. Great, thank you. So this is the fourth session in our Introduction to Buddhist Meditation and Philosophy. And as I always like to remind us at the beginning of a session, we want to adopt a mind that is free from the three faults of a faulty vessel or a broken vessel. So we don't want to be like a pot or a vessel that has a hole in it, which is to say, we want to be paying attention. We want to be mindful. We don't want to be like an overturned vessel. No matter how much water you pour on top, it doesn't hold anything. So we want to be aware and attentive to what's going on, be present. So in addition to being present, and in addition to having some sort of mindfulness focused on what we're studying, we want to avoid the fault of being like a vessel that is stained. No matter how much pure water you pour in it, it'll always be polluted. So we don't want to bring our own preconceptions to whatever subject we're studying. We want to be open-minded. So whenever we engage in study of any sort, we want to engage in that study with a mind that is attentive, a mind that is mindful, and one that is open-minded. It can be critical. We don't have to agree with everything right away, but we do it in a non-cynical way, right? There's a difference between skeptical and being cynical. One of them has a level of judgment and of ego involved, and one of them is an open and honest assessment, right? So we want to avoid those three faults. We want to adopt the three attitudes that are concordant with studying the Lamrim. So we want to adopt the extensive attitude, or we want to adopt the big picture attitude, the attitude that realizes that we aren't going to become Buddhas overnight, that there's a lot of progress to be made. So this is a slow journey, but it's one we're taking step by step. We want to take the extensive attitude, the one that recognizes there are many different facets of what we need to study, that one individual topic isn't going to be the thing that liberates us. So even when we feel overwhelmed, we can find comfort in knowing that there are many different topics, and we just slowly relax into each topic. And then as we continue, we see how they fit together. And then in addition to the big picture attitude and the extensive attitude, we have to adopt a relaxed attitude, an attitude that recognizes that if we push ourselves too hard, we'll burn out, we'll become overwhelmed, and they'll turn us away from the path. So we need to find that balance of being motivated and pushing ourselves, but recognizing that we have to take care of ourselves as well, in a worldly sense and a spiritual sense. So we have to be relaxed. And if you ever meet Tibetans, you'll know they're very good at this. This is the one they excel at. Whenever anything is stressing me out and I go to my teacher, even the two phrases you hear are central machet, just like central. We say it as meaning like don't stress out or don't be tense, but trewa is really like a tightening. So don't tighten your mind. So samkhyomoche, just like don't stress out. And then heloche is the same thing, it's relax. Or kale, go slowly. So even when I was dealing with my mother's cancer and I was taking care of her, and I was all these overwhelming things happening, right? When I was back in the States last year and helping my mother go through the death process, I'd call my teacher, or my teacher would call me to see how I was doing. And his only advice would be like, kale, go slowly and just relax. That's it. That's his whole advice for dealing with, my mother going through this death process. I think. So the Tibetans are very big on this, have a relaxed attitude, with everything you approach. That's not to say be lazy, but it's saying you can't cling to things too tightly, even virtuous things. Because if you cling too tightly and push too hard, you'll burn yourself out. So in the last couple of weeks, we've talked about how the teachings of the Buddha manifest both in terms of view and in terms of conduct or practice, right? So in view, the Buddha is teaching us how to understand the world around us and how to engage in reality. So we learned things like the Four Noble Truths, and we learned about the nature, a little bit about the nature of selflessness. And this is talking about how Buddhism teaches a philosophical system, right? So that's what we mean by view, that there's a philosophical system. But that's combined with practice. So the philosophy on its own isn't enough, right? So Buddha taught both practice and view. And so practice, we study about it with especially the 6 perfected attitudes of a Bodhisattva, or the 6 perfected minds or actions. But all of our engaging in the world is us using the philosophy to motivate and guide our actions. So the combination of view or philosophy and action or behavior is really important. You can't have one without the other. Or you can, but they won't be as meaningful or fulfilling. And I know we had a brief discussion of the Four Noble Truths, the Four Noble Truths being the bedrock of all Buddhist philosophy and thought. What the Buddha taught in the very first sermon he gave, that suffering exists, it has an origin, it has a cessation, and there's a path to lead to that cessation. And, I was just having a discussion last week. Some visitors came to visit Sarah, and I was giving a teaching to them. A group from yoga students came, and we're talking about the truth of suffering. And why did the Buddha teach the truth of suffering first? And one of the people that was part of this group is a friend. He's come every year. They bring these students with them. He's a Sanskrit professor in Israel. And he said, maybe suffering is too strong of a translation of this word, of dukkha, or dugnil in Tibetan. And I said, I don't think it is. The reason I don't think it is because we need to recognize the suffering that we experience. And right now, the reason the Buddha taught the truth of suffering first is because we don't realize the extent of our suffering, right? And we don't have a strong understanding of what is suffering and what is happiness. And we run after suffering, labeling it happiness. And we grab onto it with both hands, thinking this will make me happy. And so using the term suffering, I think is appropriate because it's trying to wake us out of our slumber to realize this isn't just something that's mildly frustrating, right? It's an existential kind of dread, So the Buddha was waking us out of our slumber. And so I think suffering is a really strong and useful term for that. Plus, just semantically, there aren't any that are better. Every translation you find, you can point to and argue why it doesn't work in some way. And of the different types of suffering we talk about, and I know you've talked about the 3 types of suffering, the suffering of suffering, which is the coarse physical and emotional and mental suffering that we experience, like sickness or pain, that even animals experience. And then the most subtle suffering is the suffering of all compounded phenomena. The very fact that we have the capacity to suffer is itself a type of suffering. But that second type of suffering, the suffering of change, is the one I focus on most. So the suffering of change is the recognition that worldly happiness is itself a type of suffering. Because our worldly happiness, the way we describe and understand things to make us happy, is almost always a transition from one type of suffering to another. And the easiest example is when you're suffering from when you're experiencing the suffering of heat and you want to be relieved of that, and you jump into a cold lake, that moment of change, you're no longer suffering the experience of heat. So you feel happy, you feel overjoyed, relaxed. But all you've done is trade the suffering of heat for the suffering of cold. And in that moment of transformation, you experience that as if it were happiness. So that's an example of the suffering of change. What we call worldly happiness is actually a type of suffering. Now, that doesn't mean we shouldn't enjoy when we find relief from the heat, right? It doesn't mean that when we're hungry and we eat a nice meal and it fills us, that we shouldn't be appreciative of that. What it means is we shouldn't label that as actual happiness. Worldly happiness is always only going to be worldly. It will never actually be, it will never be permanent, and it will never offer us any escape route out of samsara, right? And so that suffering especially is the one I think we need to focus on. Physical suffering and suffering of suffering, we can't really do much to avoid that. We can be a little bit cautious in how we exist in the world, but we're going to experience illness and harm to our bodies. That's what happens to our bodies. We can't avoid that. And the suffering of all compounded phenomena is so subtle that until we have really, really high levels of realization, it doesn't do much. Meditating on it is useful, but it doesn't do much into our everyday lives. But the suffering of change, the recognition that worldly happiness is not the same thing as transcendental or spiritual happiness. It'll never bring us actual freedom from suffering. Focusing on that, I think, is really useful. At least it's very beneficial to my practice. And then the last thing I just want to bring up as part of the review is, I think you had a brief discussion of the Lamrim and what the Lamrim is. So the stages of the path. So Lamrim in Tibetan. And so the Lamrim is a whole system of engaging with the teachings of the Buddha, right? We know the Buddha taught whatever audience was in front of him. So he taught different things to different audience members because he was teaching what the students needed to hear, always to move them forward. So that's why you see in some of the Buddhist teachings, there seem to be contradictory explanations of things, because he was teaching what that student needed to hear in order to move closer to Buddhahood. And then when they collected all the teachings of the Buddha and they wrote them down, if you look at we have a collection of them here. If you look at the what we call the Kangyur, so all the teachings of the Buddha, they're not in any thematic order. Like many of them this is the collection of the short sutras. So every sutra that is less than a certain number of verses are grouped together in one group. And these are the collection of middle-length discourses. This is the collection of long discourses. So they're collected in a way that makes them easier to contain in a collection, but thematically they don't make any sense. You know what I mean? Like there's no sequence to them. So what a number of teachers have done historically is said, okay, how do we go about studying the teachings of the Buddha? All these different things, the topics that he taught us. What is the way that we start here where we are, suffering in samsara, and get to Buddhahood? What is the sequence that is useful for our psychological development, right? How do we use these teachings to build upon one another, to bring ourselves closer to Buddhahood? And so there are a number of teachers who created systems. And the one that we are most familiar with was started by Atisha Dipankara, so a Bengali scholar who was studying at Rukamachila Monastery, and then he traveled to Tibet in the beginning of the 11th century at the request of the Tibetan king, and he was considered a major reformer, and he helped reform the type of Buddhism that was existing in Tibet at the time, which had kind of degraded. And he taught a text called Lamp for the Path to Enlightenment. And this put all of the teachings of the Buddha in a sequence for us to practice. But not only that, like I said, he wasn't the first one to do that. What he did that was novel was he separated them and identified what we call the three scopes. So there's the scope for students of a smaller capacity, a middling capacity, and great capacity. And what we mean by that is the motivation or intention through which we engage and study, and how these different psychological topics of meditation fit into these different goals. So beings of a small scope have the intention to achieve a higher rebirth. And they realize that being reborn as an animal or a hungry ghost or a hell being would prevent them from any capacity to study Dharma. So their goal is to achieve a higher rebirth. And so the topics that are included in that first section
are all what motivate us to achieve a higher rebirth. And then the beings of the middling scope realize that just achieving a higher rebirth isn't enough. Getting a nicer view from your prison cell still means you're in prison. So they want to be free from suffering entirely for themselves. They want to achieve nirvana or liberation, moksha. And so that all the meditation topics in the middle section are devoted to that goal, to being free from suffering entirely. And then the beings of the great scope realize it isn't enough for me to be free from suffering if there are still other beings suffering. So we need to achieve Buddhahood so we can free all sentient beings from suffering, not just ourselves. And so what a teacher did was he divided the different topics into these three categories. And now we have to meditate on all the topics, right? We have to start with the beginning ones because there's a gradation. So it's called stages of the path. But we use that Mahayana attitude, the attitude of wanting to benefit others, even when we are engaging in small scope meditations and the medium scope meditations. But by dividing in that way, we can see what the goal, we can see how that meditation fits into the bigger picture. That's why it's useful. And then, of course, what we study most famously is Tsongkhapa's commentary on a stages for Lamp to the Path. And his commentary is the Lamrim, his big commentary is the Lamrim Chenmo, but he's written a number of Lamrim texts. So Lamrim is a genre. The Dalai Lama identifies 8 famous Lamrim texts. There are many of them. Yeah.
So the middle length Lamrim that sometimes we are given to study, is it only it's for everybody, right? I mean, everybody can read them.
What do you mean for everybody, as opposed to?
What I mean is, the middle length Lamrim it's just like every other Lamrim, right?
So Lamrim as a genre is a genre that recognizes that there's a sequence to these topics that build upon each other in a certain way. And so it explores the topics in this sequence as a way of showing how all the teachings of the Buddha fit together. So that's the whole concept of Lamrim genre. And even a lot of prayers you go through, like we're going to be starting after the break we have, we'll be studying the 37 practices of a Bodhisattva on Saturday afternoons. And that itself it follows the sequence of the Lamrim, right? So many texts and prayers follow that sequence.
But why are there so many Lamrims?
There are so many Lamrims because it's a useful way to understand the teachings of the Buddha, and it's a useful way to know where to start and how to build your practice. Like there's a reason they go in this sequence. You don't generally just jump into the most difficult teachings first because you need to have a foundation, right? You want to build up a foundation so that your second floor isn't going to collapse. And so I'll get into that. We're going to start going through some of the topics today. And so we'll explain why those topics are taught first and how they work. But the middle length Lamrim, Choe Tsongkhapa composed that after he composed his great Lamrim. And it is the same topics, but he just has different levels of reasoning and different types of explanations for them, which is why he composed more than one Lamrim. He felt that there was different things he could say, exploring the same topics, but just giving different rationale, different quotations, different reasoning. And we often say that his explanation of emptiness in the middle length Lamrim is actually clearer and more direct than his explanation of emptiness in the larger Lamrim, right? So it's useful to read both.
When you listen to the different lengths of Lamrim is also based on the fact the different capacities of the disciples or whatever, depending on how much detail they want to study. What is there?
Yes and no. I mean, he composed them at different times. It's not always the case that a longer Lamrim or a longer text is better for students who want more detail. It's a balance. We often say that sometimes the shorter texts are for the more advanced students because you have to come in with your own knowledge ahead of time. A lot of time we study Tantra, right? And many of you have maybe attended some Tantric initiation and you know what a sadhana is. A sadhana is a daily practice where you associate yourself with a Buddha and you visualize yourself as a particular Buddha. And many people like the short sadhanas that are, you can do in 10, 15 minutes, as opposed to the long sadhanas that might last an hour and a half. When you're given a practice to do every single day and it takes an hour, they want the short ones. But our teachers say, well, those short ones are for people that already have high levels of realization because you have to have all the details in your head already. The short ones just give you the outline and the long ones give you all the details. So you have to know what is most appropriate for you. In terms of studying the texts, we should study all of them, right? By studying the longer texts, we get more details. And then something like middle length Lamrim, he's giving different types of rationale. So it's not just that it's a condensed version of the first one. It's not like an edited version of the great Lamrim. It's a whole different series of rationale and of quotations and a whole different way of approaching the material.
So which day that was that he sold his?
I don't remember now. But when his gave the Lamrim teaching, so this is the 8 he gave Lungs of. I can find them very easily. If you search, if you just search online for the 8 Lamrim texts from His Holiness, they list it. But so the great treatise in the Sage of the Path of Enlightenment, the Middle Length, and then the Song of Freedom, which is the 3 swift ones. Yeah, that's like the condensed version of it. But then there are a few. There's also they're from a few from an Amdo scholar called the Zamkar teachings. So they're very easy to search online. I don't remember all 8 of them off the top of my head.
Do other schools of Tibetan Buddhism have their own stages in the past?
Yeah, so even preceding Tsongkhapa, for a good example, is I can't remember his name now, but there's a Nyingmapa teaching that's very famous, and they call it the Tenrim Temple. So ten means teachings. So Tenrim is the sequence of discourses or sequence of teachings. So it's conceptually very similar to the Lamrim, where it's taking the teachings of the Buddha and putting them in an order that's useful for study and practice. Now, what it teaches uncommon addition was this idea of the 3 scopes. He was the first one to introduce this idea. But before him, other teachers had created what we would call Lamrim material. So in the Nyingma school, they call it Tenrim. And I don't know about the other schools, like if they have a special name for it or not, but they have this practice of doing the same thing, you know. We often say it was unique to Tsongkhapa and to Atisha, but that's not entirely true. What's true is his system of recognizing these 3 scopes. And we talk about the 3 scopes, those are kinds of motivation. So Pabonka Rinpoche in his commentary says, if you have 4 people all reciting Tara praises together, and one of them is reciting them because he wants to achieve happiness in this life and fame and fortune or other beneficial activities in this life, then he is not even practicing Dharma. If one is meditating, is reciting them with the intention that he wants to achieve a good rebirth, then he's practicing Dharma in the lower scope. If one is reciting them with the intention to be free from suffering, he's practicing Dharma of the middle scope. And if one is reciting them because they want to become a Buddha to benefit all sentient beings, they're practicing Dharma of the Mahayana scope, the Bodhisattva scope. But the external action may look the same. They're all reciting praises together. But their internal action is what is distinguishing whether it is a Dharma action or a non-Dharma action, and what level or scope, quote unquote, of practice that it may be, right? So we talk about the 3 scopes. It's important to understand it's recognizing 3 different levels of motivation or inspiration that lead to different outcomes. So the very first topic, the first topics we meditate on, we call topics that are shared in common with small scope beings, right? And we say it that way to remind ourselves that we're not practicing small scope practices. We're practicing Mahayana practice that is shared with the small scope, if that makes sense, which is why that reminder that we always have bodhicitta as our motivation, okay? But so the first one I want to talk about is what we call perfect human rebirth. And I should just say, in this series, we have this 9-week series, it's Introduction to Buddhist Meditation and Philosophy. This is an overview, right? If we go into the more in-depth series, we'll do a whole topic on perfect human rebirth that would last 6, 7, 8 weeks, just on that one topic. And every topic we're going to go through, we could do a whole 6 to 8 week series just on that topic. And today, I'm going to get through maybe, if I don't talk too much, 4 or 5 of them. So it's an overview, okay? So just know that, and I'm not going to go into as much detail as I can, but if you have questions about it, then definitely ask them. Okay. The first topic we do is, like I said, the perfect human rebirth. So it's very easy to take for granted how fortunate we are, that we have the capacity to study Dharma, that we have access to the teachings, and we have the physiological and psychological means to engage in studying a spiritual life. And so we meditate on the perfect human rebirth as a way to inspire us to practice and to remind us how fortunate we are that we have the capacity to practice. You know, they say that perfect human rebirth is not quite the same as a human rebirth. Perfect human rebirth is qualified as having 8 freedoms and 10 richnesses or endowments. And so the 8 freedoms, there are 4 that relate to non-human states that you're free from, and there are 4 that relate to human conditions that you're free from. And so the four non-human states that we're free from is we're free from being reborn as a hell being or a hungry ghost or an animal, as well as from being reborn as a long life God. So those are the four freedoms that are related to non-human states. And now the first three are very easy to understand. We say that when you're reborn in the lower realms, your suffering is so great that there's no capacity to study Dharma. Like you don't have the mental capacity because you're overwhelmed with suffering. So therefore, being able to study is something you don't even think about. A spiritual path isn't something that can cross your mind. And we know this in our lives, right? Like even in our human lives, when our circumstances become overwhelming, if we don't already have a strong practice that brings us through, it's easy to feel overwhelmed and lose track of everything that we're doing. That's why it's important to have a foundational practice so that when life gets overwhelming, we have the resources to deal with it. Now, the fourth one, being free from being born as a long life God, that is recognizing that there's a certain type of desire realm God, or desire realm God, who live for eons and eons and eons, but they don't experience physical suffering. They actually experience physical bliss quite often, and mental bliss. And so there's never any motivation for them to practice in any meaningful way, you know? So what these four are pointing to is that being born human, we have this balance of suffering that motivates us to practice, but not too much suffering that we don't have the capacity to practice. There's a balance, right? If we didn't have any coarse suffering at all, you would never think, why should I practice a spiritual path? Why would I want to be free from this? So the long life gods, their experience of suffering comes right at the end of their life. They say that long life gods, right before they die, they can see where they're going to be reborn. They have this type of clairvoyance. And they've exhausted so much positive karma, living this blissful life as a god, that almost always they go from the realm of the god realms to a lower state, to an animal or a hungry ghost or a hell rebirth. So it's not just like an easy rebirth. They go from really high to really low, and they can see that. They have this clairvoyance at the end of their life. And then their body starts decaying, and all around them, there are like dead, rotten flowers start falling from the sky like this. And so all the other gods shun them like this. So they feel intense emotional suffering at the end of their life, but it's too late to practice at that point, right? We don't have that. So for better or worse, our experiences of discomfort and of suffering have motivated us to practice in the same way the Buddha taught suffering as the first of the noble truths.
When you describe the like everything's rotting and stuff like that, this is sort of, what should I say? I mean, it's like a physical description, or it's like allegorical or something.
So the long life gods, so we do believe that these are actual types of rebirthing beings. So like the rotting of flowers and the decaying smell that comes off them is a thing. We as humans don't have the correct karma to see them or experience them. So there could be different, God realm beings existing in this space with us, but due to the way our minds work and our karma, we don't have the ability to experience them. So that isn't something we can experience as humans, but the other types of beings that are reborn in that same state would experience. So it's not just like a conceptual thing or an analogy, like they truly exist, at least we say they do. But as humans, unless you have high levels of mental realization, we don't have the karma to see them. So those are the four freedoms that are related to the non-human states. The four freedoms related to the human state are that we are not born with inherent wrong views that we can't shake, right? We're not born in what's called a barbaric land, which is to say a land where we don't have freedom to practice a spiritual path of our choice. We're not, barbaric is a very harsh word for that. That's kind of the translation. It's that we're not born in the land where our freedom of spiritual practice is limited. We are not born at a time when a Buddha has not appeared. So there are times in the history of this planet, for instance, where there were no teachings from a Buddha because the Buddha had not appeared. Now we say Shakyamuni Buddha is the fourth Buddha. Before him, there were three Buddhas that appeared in Jambudvipa, right, in this realm of existence. And after him, a fifth Buddha will appear when the teachings of the Buddha have degenerated and have been forgotten for a certain amount of time. Then Maitreya will come and take the form of a human being, and the whole cycle will start again, right? But we are born at a time when a Buddha appeared, and so that we're free from being born at a time when there was no Buddha appearing. And lastly, we are free from being born mute or of having insufficient mental faculties, right? And again, what's important to realize is that there's not a judgment with people that are born with insufficient mental faculties or people that are mute. This is a recognition that having a mind that is able to study Dharma is necessary to become free, and being able to recite texts and prayers and mantras is a beneficial way to accumulate karma and merit and to become free. So it's not a judgment. It's recognizing that these are tools that we need to use to be free from suffering, right? So if we don't have them, it makes it harder. It's not a judgment saying one person, so a person with incomplete mental faculties is not as good of a person as someone with complete mental faculties. There's no judgment like that. But that is, they obviously have a more difficult time experiencing the world around them and trying to be free from their suffering than someone with complete mental faculties. When you're talking about karma and rebirth, it's very easy to feel judgmental because we're used to adding in just a little, little bit of judgment to everything we say and do. But most of this is just trying to be descriptive and saying that if if you're physically handicapped and then you can't make prostrations, then that takes one avenue of practice away from you, right? And now that may not be the most important avenue of practice. There are other ways to accumulate merit, and mental practice is more important than physical practice. But anytime you remove one avenue of practice, you've just limited your options, so it's harder, right? And that's what this is recognizing. So those are the 8 freedoms. We're free from being born as a hell being, hungry ghost, animal, or long life god. And we are free from being born with inherent wrong views that we can't change. We're free from being born in a country where we can't practice a spiritual path of our choosing. We're free from being born at a time when there was no Buddha appearing. And we are free from being with incomplete senses, both mental or physical. Yeah, so this is a difficult one to talk about.
And just to add to that, some people are born with inherent, like Hitler was born with inherent wrong views.
But I mean, that could be changed, is my point.
Well, yeah, so there is no, all they say in the text is wrong view. But the problem is we all have wrong views, right? We have numerous wrong views. That some of them are, as we talked about yesterday, some of them are innate, that we're born with them. We believe things to be truly existent. That's an innate wrong view. And then we have acquired wrong views where different philosophical systems or scientific systems or cultural systems have taught us things about reality that we accept as true but are not true. So what this is saying is that, yes, any wrong view can be changed. Any negative mind we have, it can be changed. If it couldn't be changed, then we could never be free from suffering, right? So no matter what wrong view you have, it can be changed. But some people are born with wrong views that are so strong that no matter what logic or practice or experience is given to them, they're not going to change that wrong view in their lifetime. So if you are born, and if you're born in a place where you definitely believe that everything exists from its own side, due to whatever religious system you're part of, or cultural system, or philosophical system, or whatever, and no matter how much logic or meditation or practice you experience, you'll never waver from that view. That's what we're talking about. So just really, really strong wrong views that no amount of practice is going to change in this life. Now, it's true, though, that as you said, all wrong views, we have the capacity to change them because we all have the capacity to become Buddhists. So even the most entrenched, deep wrong view that we hold, we can change. But the fact that we are even open to exploring the teachings of the Buddha is indication that we don't have this level of wrong view, right? Yeah.
No, I just want to say, sorry, the example you gave of things appearing, things you believe that things exist on their own is an example of what we were discussing as an innate wrong view that was develops over many lifetimes and only can be eliminated on the path of meditation. But there can also be like you said, cultural wrong views that are very strongly, right?
Yeah. So the difference between, and we talked about this is a little more advanced, but we'll bring it up. When we have wrong views, we talk about both innate wrong views and acquired wrong views. So we can get rid of innate wrong views, but not abandon them to the path of meditation, right? But we get rid of them insofar as they don't necessarily guide our actions, right? But so an innate wrong view is one that we're born with. And then we say the root of samsara is the belief that the I exists independent, right? The self-grasping, the grasping at the self as truly existent. That is the root of samsara. So that and other types of afflicted minds are innate insofar as we aren't taught them, but due to our experience as suffering beings in samsara, we have them automatically. Whereas acquired wrong views are things we learn incorrectly. Now, you could have a view that perceives all phenomena as being truly existent, that is also acquired, right? If you came from a philosophical system that taught that, you could have both an innate and an acquired wrong view that's focused on the same thing, right? But so here we're not talking about just wrong views in general. It's wrong views that are so entrenched that you're never going to waver from it. And the fact that we are even engaging in philosophical exploration shows that we don't have this. Okay. So the 10 freedoms, excuse me, those are the 8 freedoms. And the 10 endowments, there are 10 endowments related to ourself, and 5 endowments related to ourself, and 5 related to our environment. Okay. The 5 related to ourself is that we're born human. We are born in the texts say a Buddhist country, but what that means is a country where we have the capacity to practice a spiritual path of our own choosing, or the Dharma of the Buddha. We are born with intact faculties, both physical and mental faculties. And we are born free from extreme actions. So we often talk about the 5 uninterrupted actions, an action of having killed your mother or your father, having drawn blood, having killed an arhat, having drawn blood from a Buddha, or having caused a division in the Sangha, right? These actions that are so intense, they're called uninterrupted, because if you commit them and you don't purify that negative karma, when you die from this life, you'll immediately be reborn in a lower realm without any intervening steps. And we're born free of that karma of having done that. So free from extreme actions, and we're born with faith in the Dharma. Now, again, this is a hard one, because most of us weren't born having innate faith in the teachings of the Buddha. We came to it later in life. But what this means is we were born in a state where we have an open mind and a capacity to study and develop faith, right? So that's a quality that we can cultivate, even if we don't have it at the moment of our birth, right? But we cultivate it in our lives. So those are 5 types of richnesses or endowments that we have that are related to ourselves. And the 5 that are related to our environment is we are born in a place where the Buddha appeared. And then not only did the Buddha appear, but the Buddha taught. And then the teachings themselves flourished and were spread. And there were followers who continued to propagate those teachings and hold them as authentic and true. And there were kind teachers who then taught them, right? So the 8 and the 10 overlap quite a bit, right? They're like different, not 100%, but they're like different sides of the same coin. Now, the reason we meditate on these 18 points individually is they help remind us how incredibly rare this human birth is that we have. The example they give, we try to use, we think of it as rare by means of example and by means of enumeration, as well as by means of its causes. So by example, they talk about if we visualize all of the earth as one giant ocean, and on that ocean, the waves of karma and delusion create a wildly turbulent ocean. And you have the yoke of an ox floating on top of the ocean. And there is an old turtle who's blind, swimming in that ocean, who only comes up for air every 100 years. The likelihood of that turtle coming up for air and rising up right in the center of that yoke is the same as being reborn as a perfect human rebirth, right? Which seems ridiculous to think about, but it's the same. That is not, it's incredibly rare that we have this. I think the way for me to think about it, that's a little more, like, I think that's a really fun, nice story, and it's very like graphic and visual. What's more useful for me is just think about the other sentient beings that we share this earth with, who don't have any access to the Dharma. First off, you can think of other human beings who, for whatever reason, either don't have any interest in studying, never mind Buddhism, just a spiritual life at all, right? And then outside of human beings, think of the animal realm. How many animals are there that obviously they can't study a spiritual path? They're living in a lower region, right? They have no capacity for this kind of mental engagement. The number of like insects alone is magnitudes, like hundreds and thousands of magnitudes more than human beings. Never mind human beings that have access to spiritual teachings and practice and study. So the fact that we are reborn as a human with an inclination to engage in spiritual study is incredibly rare. So that, just the numbers game for me is very convincing, is more convincing than the really wonderful story of the turtle, which is just like emotional and nice graphic imagery. But then we also can think about how difficult it is to be reborn as a human. To be reborn as a human with perfect human rebirth, we have to have stainless morality. That's the most important cause. There are a number of causes, but having stainless, pure morality is what helps us be reborn as a human. That's the primary cause, or one of the primary causes. And we can look at our own lives and see how often our morality isn't as up to snuff as we might want it to be, right? I'm not saying we're bad people, but we're not perfect either. So we think, if I keep making these mistakes, my morality isn't as pure as I want, how much work must it have been in my past lives to develop the karma to be reborn as a human? It's very rare, very, very rare. So that's the reason this is taught first, because it gives us an appreciation of how fortunate we are to have access to engaging in spiritual teachings. And I think in the 21st century, we can think about this in an even bigger way, that for all that the information age and the digital age has caused like different types of neuroses and problems in the world, we have access to Dharma in a way that no other time on earth or has ever experienced, right? The fact that I grew up in the middle of nowhere America and have access to these ancient teachings from India that were over 3,000 years ago that have been translated into English, brought over multiple continents, and then I can go online and find teachings on all these topics from many different learned scholars, as well as access to root texts. That's phenomenal. It's so incredibly rare. And so to not take advantage of that is to throw away our life. And we can think about that in other aspects too. We see what resources do we have available to us, whether they be fiscal resources or emotional resources or educational opportunities. To not take full advantage of the opportunities we have is giving up this rare opportunity, right? We say it's like finding a diamond in a mud pile. And then to take that diamond and just throw it away would be foolish, right? Or they say it's like going through all the difficulties of traveling to an island made of jewels only to turn around and come back again and leave empty-handed, right? It's so incredible, this opportunity we have. And so we meditate on the perfect human rebirth to really remind ourselves of that. And what you'll find as you study these topics, especially the topics that are common with the small scope, is that intellectually they're really easy to understand, right? We can just look around us and see how privileged we are, even with whatever difficulties we may experience in our lives, whatever types of marginalization or oppression we may have in our lives, we're still remarkably privileged, right? We can see that intellectually. Understanding that intellectually and having an emotional understanding of it that imbues all of our actions with significance is different. So this practice is giving you all of the logic and reasons to then meditate on, so you transform this intellectual understanding into a lived experience. And so the next topic, so once you have some sort of recognition and appreciation for all these opportunities that you have, the next topic is to compel you to actually use those opportunities. So first, developing an appreciation. That's why perfect human rebirth is often taught first. And then next, we study death and impermanence. And that is to help motivate us to practice. So we meditate on death and impermanence, not because we want to be depressed or downtrodden. We don't want to be gloomy. We meditate on it because it reminds us how incredibly fortunate we are to be living right now and to have the capacity to practice, right? So this isn't like a depressing type of meditation. We study it first because it motivates us. We live our lives under this belief. We all know we're going to die, yet at the same time, we don't live our lives recognizing that we could die at any time, right? When we talk about death and impermanence, we usually generally say there are 9 points we meditate on. And the 9-point death meditation is very famous. And maybe we'll do that today. But those 9 points are 3 categories. And the first one is that death is certain, right? We are all going to die. They say this is the hardest one to realize. We all understand it intellectually, but actually realizing that we are going to die. It's very, very difficult. And it's not meant to make you depressed, it's meant to make you realistic. Because after that, the next of the categories is that the time of death is uncertain. Death is certain, the time of death is uncertain. So we all live our lives believing we're going to live until a ripe old age of some sort, right? But the truth is, there's no guarantee that all of us are going to live to the end of this teaching, right? There's no guarantee. Never mind make it home tonight. Never mind wake up tomorrow morning. We probably will. Chances are we will. There's no guarantee we will. When you really are able to accept that you are going to die, and then there's no guarantee of how long you're going to live, that you could die at any moment, then that motivates you. Why would I not spend this moment practicing? Because the next of the three main topics is that the only thing that will benefit you at the time of your death is your spiritual practice. That's the only thing you can take with you. Anything else you do in this life is not going to help you at the time of death. You can't take it with you. It'll make your life now more comfortable, and that might make your ability to practice easier. So it's not saying avoid all those things, but it's saying that that is not going to help at the time of death.
But when people, they also say that certain, like let's say you're good at music, it means that you have had music whatever before, right? I mean, like some people who are born with like great musical talent, so like those kind of stuff.
So you're talking about different imprints, but that's not going to help you at the time of death. So if in this life, if you take, let's say, study music really well and you become a virtuoso at music, right? Then in future lives, you've already created imprints of this association with music. So in future lives, it may be easier for you to play music again, right? Which is why we see instances of young children who are 3 or 4 years old who are prodigies, right? Because there's something about, we say there's some sort of imprint they created in past lives, a familiarity with that makes it easy for you. But that doesn't help you at the time of death, right? It does. The imprints you've created do come with you from life to life. That's not helping you at the time of death. So the way we break this down into the 9 points is death is certain. So what are the points that we meditate on? We say that everyone dies. Do you know anyone that hasn't died? Right? These are the ways you convince yourself or recognize that death is certain. First, you meditate on the fact that everyone dies. Like, do you know anyone that has not died? And then 2, our lifespan is constantly decreasing. From the moment of our birth, the amount of our lifespan is going down because we're always moving closer to death. Every day is one step closer to our death. So our lifespan is constantly decreasing. It's not increasing. And then the body itself is a conditioned phenomena. What that means is it is not permanent. It is constantly changing, right? And so these 3 points, that there's no one that hasn't died, our lifespan is constantly decreasing, and our bodies themselves are impermanent and made up of conditioned phenomena that's dependent upon other things. We meditate on those individually to remind ourselves that we are definitely going to die, that death is certain, it's definite. And again, this is the hardest one to actually realize. Once we've done that, then we move on to the time of death being uncertain. And the 3 subtopics we meditate on for that are the meditation that the human lifespan is uncertain. We know there are infants who die, and there are people who live well past, into their hundreds. There's no definite lifespan. You're not guaranteed to live a certain number of years, right? We have examples of that all the time, of people who die as infants, and people who die when they're 110. So the lifespan is not definite. And not only is the human lifespan not definite, there are many causes that can cause us to die. There are actually more causes for our death than there are for our life, if you think about it. Think about how many conditions you need to stay alive, right? We need to be somewhere where there's air to breathe that allows us to receive the oxygen that fuels our body and keeps our heart pumping, right? And keeps our mind oxygenated and working. And the earth is 70% ocean. There are more places on earth that would bring about our death than those that bring about our life, right? there are many conditions or many different causes that could bring about death. And lastly, our bodies are fragile. That's the third point. No matter how well we take care of our bodies, how many reps we do at the gym, how good shape we're in, our bodies are inherently fragile. And the fact that we're able to live is miraculous, actually, considering how easy it is. Just one slip in the wrong place, one crack of it, once hitting your head on the ground too hard, and you're gone. Right? So those are the three things we meditate on to think about the fact that the time of death is uncertain. And then lastly, the only thing that's a benefit to us is our spiritual practice. So they say at the time of your death, your loved ones are of no benefit to you. They can't make your death more meaningful or less meaningful, and more meaningful. And generally, they say that having loved ones around you when you die, if they're all crying and experiencing great distress, makes your death more difficult. It's better to not have loved ones around you because they make your death harder, or they can. That's the way the teachings talk about it. Obviously, we can have people around us who are facilitating a peaceful death. But in general, if there are people with great, strong emotions around you, then they're going to make your death more difficult because your mind won't be at rest. You won't have a peaceful mind if there are people lamenting and screaming and crying all around you. Okay? So our loved ones, who may be so helpful to us in our life, they won't help us at the time of death. They can't stop our death from happening. And whatever wealth or possessions we've accumulated in this life, they won't stop our death from happening either. We can't take them with us. And then lastly, our body itself is of no benefit at the time of death. In fact, it's the exact opposite. Our body is failing us. So the time of death, the only thing that helps us is our spiritual practice. Our friends and family don't help us. Our wealth and our possessions don't help us. And our body doesn't help us. The only thing that provides us any benefit is what practice we've accumulated. Because we say the time of death is incredibly important. If we're not able to achieve Buddhahood in this life, then we want to be able to be reborn again in a place where we have a perfect human rebirth and the capacity to study Dharma. And a big part of what rebirth we take, there are two factors. One is, have we created the causes for that perfect human rebirth? So have we created the positive karma that would result in a perfect human rebirth? And then two, at the time of death, what is our state of mind? Because we say that we've created causes for all different types of rebirths, right? In this life and in past lives. It's not like I've only created the cause for one rebirth, right? My actions in this life, I've planted many, many different seeds. Some would be, I'd be reborn as a human, some I'd be reborn as an animal, and so forth. So the question is, which one of those seeds ripens into my next rebirth? And they say that the factors that determine which karmic seeds ripen is the state of mind at the time of death. So we first have to plant as many virtuous seeds as possible, right? That's going to give us the best opportunity. But then at the time of death, if we have a disturbed mind, that's going to activate a non-virtuous seed. If we have a mind that is full of fear and full of distrust or anger or regret, or harmful regret rather, then that's going to activate a negative rebirth. But if we have a mind of peace, a mind of contentment, a mind that isn't distressed, that's going to activate a positive seed. So to some extent, our Buddhist practice is all about preparing for a good death. Having a death that's meaningful and having a death that's calm and peaceful. Sometimes they talk about our practice that way, that everything we do is preparing for our death. That can be a little bit of a heavy-handed way to think about our practice, right? But the point is, the mind we have at the time of death is incredibly important. So if we do the work now, we develop a strong spiritual practice, then we won't have that fear when we die. When our death comes, we won't be afraid of what's going to happen next. Because we'll have developed the ability to have a calm mind, we'll have developed confidence in the teachings of the Buddha and confidence in our ability to practice those teachings. Confidence that what we've done in this life has been meaningful by dedicating ourselves to others in thought and in deed. And if you can die with that confidence and with that peaceful mind, that's ensuring that your next life will be one where you continue to practice towards Buddhahood without obstacles or with fewer obstacles. That's what we say our spiritual practice is what benefits us at the time of death. So what I thought we'd do is we take maybe 15 minutes now, 20 minutes to meditate on death. And then we'll take a break after that. Give you a little bit of a chance to get some tea or coffee and get rid of the death. But let's take a moment to settle into a comfortable position. And now we'll do, just as a primer, we're going to do the 9-point death meditation. But we're doing it in a very condensed way. If you want to do this practice on your own, you can spend a long time in your session on just one of these topics, right? There are 9 points, 3 categories, each with 3 points. You might spend one session only on the first 3 and spend 20 minutes or a half hour on those first 3. Then the next day, you do the next 3. Then the next day, the next 3. And like this, you can cycle through them so you can see what suits your needs. We're going to do a condensed version just to give you a flavor of them, but you can do this much more slowly developed, right? It's the same for all of the meditations. Any meditation you do, you can break it apart into a way that works for you. There's actually, I recently read a book this year, a biography of a woman who is a death doula. So, you know, a doula is like a midwife who helps the pregnant, who helps birth. She is a death doula who helps people transition to a positive death or a peaceful death. She works out of America. And her biography is called Briefly, Perfectly Human, I think it's called. And it's really beautiful. And I can't remember her name off the top of my head, I can look it up. But she's not Buddhist. She has interacted with Buddhist communities, and she talks about doing a 9-point death meditation with one of her clients. And she changes the last point a little bit because she's not Buddhist. And so the point of your spiritual practice doesn't line up with her kind of ecumenical spiritual beliefs, but the other points are the exact same. And so she takes this away from a Buddhist point of view and says, look, this can help everyone. It's really, really beautiful, actually. If you remind me during the break, I'll look up her name. But so this practice is really powerful. So let's start by having a comfortable seat. As with any meditation, we want to feel balanced. We want to feel secure. We want to feel grounded. So if you're sitting, that means sit in such a way that you're not experiencing distress and that you don't feel like you're going to tip over in any way. And if you're in a chair, let yourself have your feet flat, both your feet flat on the ground, just about shoulder length apart. Now, we want our spine to be nice and straight. And we know the spine isn't actually straight, but we can visualize our spine as if it were a stack of coins. We'll let that dictate how we're nice and straight. So we're not tucked in deep and we're not kind of having our chest out. We let our hands, we can let them rest where they naturally fall on our thighs. Or if you prefer, you can have them in the meditation mudra, which is your right hand on top of your left, palms up, and your thumbs just barely touching. And this stays at the level of your navel. So if you prefer to do this, you can. Or you can just let your hands rest where they naturally lie on your thighs. Our head rests on top of our spine, following the natural curve of our neck. So we don't have it lifted up or tucked down, but just naturally resting where it wants to go. We let our jaws be nice and loose, not tight. So they may hang open a little, and that's okay. We let our tongue rest on the hard palate behind our teeth, our upper teeth. This is a little bit unusual at first if you're not used to it, but this helps prevent saliva from pooling in your mouth, and it helps your airflow. Now, ideally, we let our eyes stay open or half open, just following the bridge of our nose to the space in front. They're not focused, but we aren't trying to fall asleep. We're trying to wake up, so we keep them open. If that becomes too distracting for you, you can close them, but ideally, we should keep them open. And now let your breath fall into its natural rhythm. We're not going to force it. We don't need to make it any faster or slower than normal, but we'll just take a moment to let it fall into its natural rhythm. And as it does, we'll take 1 minute to bring our awareness to our breath. Use that as a way to calm our mind, to ease our way into this meditation practice. So as you breathe in, you can just notice breathing in. And as you breathe out, you can say to yourself, breathing out. You notice yourself distracted, whether an internal distraction or an external one. Just recognize that you're distracted and return your awareness to your object of meditation. There's no judgment, just the recognition, distraction. So first, we want to bring to mind the awareness that death is certain. The way we think about this is first meditate on the fact that everyone dies. There is no one I know in this life who has not died. So as you sit, allow yourself to contemplate this thought. If it helps, you can let it travel on your breathing. So as you breathe in, you say to yourself, death is certain. And as you breathe out, you can say to yourself, everybody dies, or there is no one that has defied death. If it helps to let it ride your breath, then you can do that. Or you just allow your awareness to contemplate this topic, this idea. If you want to be more direct, you can even contemplate, there is no one that defies death. It is definite that I will die. And next, you can bring to mind that your lifespan is constantly decreasing. Every moment you're alive brings you closer to your own death. So as you breathe in, you can say to yourself, the lifespan itself is constantly decreasing. But then as you breathe out, it is definite that I will die. Every moment I'm alive brings me closer to my own death. It is definite I will die. And lastly, bring to mind the fact that this body is not permanent. It's made up of many causes and conditions. It is a conditioned phenomenon. Therefore, it is definite that I will die. So all conditioned phenomena eventually cease to exist. So this body is not independent and causeless. It is definite I will die. Now we bring to mind the fact that our lifespan, that the time of death is uncertain. So the first meditation on this topic, we remind ourselves that the human lifespan is indefinite. There are some humans that don't live outside of the womb, and some humans that live to be over 100 years old. There's nothing definite about the human lifespan. So as you breathe in, you can say to yourself, there's no guarantee how long a human life will last. The time of my death is uncertain. Next, we bring to mind that There are many causes that can bring about my death. Environmental causes, other sentient beings. There are countless number of circumstances or causes that can bring about my death. Therefore, the time of my death is uncertain. And lastly, bring to mind the fact that the human body is incredibly fragile. Therefore, the time of my death is uncertain. Now we want to meditate on the fact that at the time of death, only our spiritual practice will be of benefit. So at first, we remind ourselves that at the time of death, my friends and family, all those I hold dear in this life, will not be able to be of benefit to me when I die. They won't prevent my death. They won't be something I take with me to my future lives. As you breathe in, you can remind yourselves at the time of my death, friends and family will be of no benefit. And as you breathe out, only my spiritual practice will be of benefit. Next, at the time of my death, all of my wealth and possessions will be of no benefit at all. Only my spiritual practice will be of benefit. I cannot buy my way out of dying. No matter how many things I own, they will not prevent my death. So only my spiritual practice will help me. And finally, the time of death, even this body that I have treasured for so long, is of no benefit to me. It fails me. Only my spiritual practice will be of benefit. And now lastly, you combine all of these together. You say, since it is definite I will die, and since there is no guarantee when that will happen, and since I know the only thing that will benefit me at the time of my death is my spiritual practice, then I will not waste another moment, but commit myself to doing the inner work now, immediately, and constantly. I will not delay in engaging in spiritual study, contemplation, and practice. I have found this perfect human rebirth that is so difficult to find. I will not waste a single moment of it, since I know it is impermanent and I can die at any moment. Therefore, I commit myself to doing the inner work of engaging on a spiritual journey. Now, as you're ready, allow your awareness to return to your breathing for just a moment. Breathing, breathing out. If you're comfortable, you can allow your awareness to return to the room. Thank you. So you can see the goal of this topic isn't to make us depressed or unhappy. It's to light a fire under our butts to say, why am I not practicing? You know, Lama Zopa often would talk about perfect human rebirth and death and impermanence. Both. He would say, we look at animals, for instance, like animals that are kept as pets, and we think they live like kings and queens, how much care we give to our dogs and our cats and so forth. And he says, if you could be able to get into the mind of an animal for just one moment, let's say a dog that is pampered and taken care of, has all the food it wants, their owner cleans up its waste after it, right? If you could be in that animal's mind for one moment, you would be so terrified that you would never sleep again. All you would do is practice Dharma. Because their lives are so chaotic and discordant, the amount of suffering they experience, that we don't have access to as humans. But if you really realize that, you'd realize how precious this human life is, and you wouldn't want to waste a moment of it. You'd do nothing but practice Dharma. So we want to try to cultivate that same attitude. And so these first 2 points help us. We realize this precious human rebirth. The texts often say it is so difficult to find, it's found only once. Now we know that isn't true. We can be reborn as a human again, but it's so rare that they say it's as if you can only find it once. There's no guarantee we're going to find another perfect human rebirth. We have this jewel now, and instead of wasting it, we need to practice. So meditating on our own death helps encourage us to practice. And now for us who live in such a busy world, and for you who live as lay people, who have jobs, who have school, who have family, who have all these things, that's why I say it's so important to say, how can I bring my spiritual practice into my everyday life? How can I go about my study or my job or my work or taking care of my parents or my children or my friends and make that part of my spiritual practice? How can I go to the movies and enjoy 2 hours, but that can also be spiritual practice? I think it's really powerfully important that we don't let our spiritual practice just be something we do in isolation, right? So these meditations encourage us and remind us how important it is to practice. And then we need to then continue to find ways to make that practice permeate everything we do. Make our whole lives meaningful, not just when we've come together. So that is the first 2 topics of the Lamrim: perfect human rebirth and death and impermanence. They're both topics that are shared in common with lower scope. And they're about recognizing the privileges we have and then developing the motivation to not waste those privileges. And so let's take a break. We will take, yeah, go ahead.
It's
What? So I am of the belief that we can make anything we do part of our spiritual journey. So if you're engaging in pop culture, whether it be movies, reading, music, you can use that as an opportunity to look at the story being told, for instance, and see what part of the emotional responses of that are in line with how you understand the world, and what kind of lessons can you take from it. You know, Lama Tsongkhapa when Lama Tsongkhapa and Lama Yeshe first came to the US, so in the early 70s, they're in California, and a bunch of the students wanted to bring Lama Yeshe to the movies. And he said, no, Rinpoche will go. You have to. And so Rinpoche didn't want to go, but Lama Yeshe made him. And he said, okay, if we go to the movies, it has to be one that has a lot of suffering, so we have something to meditate on, right? So any of our experiences can give us something to meditate on, right? Even if that is just noticing our own reactions. Like if you watch a movie and then you say, why did that action cause me to have desire or attachment? What is it about that made me angry, made me frustrated, made me excited? It gives you another avenue to look into your own mind, right? And part of it is we live in the world. I mean, maybe not me so much since I'm isolated, but for those of us that live in the world, sometimes we need to recognize that there are things we can do to cause us like worldly happiness. We don't have to avoid it entirely, right? We just have to realize it's not real happiness. So maybe going and enjoying a good film, if you had a very stressful day or week or month, is something that is, you can make it a spiritual practice and make it a self-care, like a worldly type of self-care as well. So that's the only reason I bring that up is I don't want people to think that by engaging in the practice of Buddhism, you only have to go live in a cave and like, you know, beat yourself with like a whip and like be unhappy all the time. It's like you can continue doing the things you do as a worldly person, but you transform those activities into a spiritual practice. Now it's easy to say I'm doing that and just be lazy, you know what I mean? But we can do it. I definitely believe we can. And I try to myself. And so that's why I bring that up. I think our spiritual journey is one that has to be every moment of our life. And so that is broad and encompassing everything we do. And even that motivation, I think, is powerful, right? Even if you say, okay, I want to engage in this pop culture in such a way that is part of my spiritual journey, and then you, whatever, watch a movie or whatever, and you say, okay, I didn't get anything out of it. The fact that you made that effort is inclining your mind towards Dharma, right? And that effort alone is useful, you know? And it's the same when you go to work every day, or you go to school, or you study something that is really boring that you don't want to study, or you go to work and do really mind-numbing job that you maybe don't like all the time. You say, well, I'm not doing this just because I want to get a good job, or I want to have money, I want to have a luxury in this life. I'm doing this because I realize that these are ways that I can give myself more opportunities to engage in spiritual practice, right? Having more privileges and resources makes my practice easier. If I have to live on the street, then it's harder for me to practice Dharma. If I don't have enough food to eat, it's hard for me to practice Dharma. But if I do this, even if it is something that I'm not particularly interested in, it can give me resources that I can use to help others, right? So we can bring that motivation to everything we do. Moving is a hard, it might just be my 21st century American sentimentality that says I want to watch movies, but I think it is possible. Okay, so with that, let's take a break. We will take a 10-minute break, some tea, some biscuits, and then we'll come back and see how many other topics we can get through, okay? Thank you. So we'll be back in a few minutes for those of us who are joining us online. Okay, friends, let's return to our seats, into the space. So for those that were curious, the book I mentioned earlier, it's called Briefly Perfectly Human. The subtitle is Making an Authentic Life by Getting Real About the End. And the author is a woman named Alua Arthur. A-L-U-A is her first name, Arthur is her last name. And it is part memoir, part her experience engaging with people who are part of the process of dying. I think it's really, really actually well done. She does this really good job of balancing something in her life, like a part of her life story, especially something that she had like a misunderstanding about. And then she tells a story about working with someone who was in the process of dying and how she learned something about that that could have made her own life experiences better. So she's not teaching, and she's not talking about just how to have a happy life. How to have a happy death. It's how thinking about death makes our lives more meaningful now. So it's a very Buddhist concept. So it's a very wonderful book if you are interested in it. So continuing our journey on the stages of the path of enlightenment, we've talked about perfect human rebirth, and we've talked about death and impermanence. So one of those is reminding us of the incredible privileges we have. And then the next is motivating us to not waste those privileges, right? So traditionally in the Lamrim, the next topic would be meditating on the suffering of the lower realms, because you want, in common with the being of the small scope, you don't want to be reborn in lower realms. You have a motivation to at least be reborn as a human. But we're going to jump over that, and we're going to focus on something that's closer in line with the middle scope being, which is developing a mind of renunciation. And we develop renunciation with our understanding of karma, of the law of cause and effect. So renunciation is a critical part of the Buddhist path. And it's very often, it's easy to misunderstand renunciation. We think renunciation means, because it means to renounce means to give up, right? So the question is, well, what are we giving up? And like I said, are we giving up all the things in this life that make us happy? Are we giving up all worldly pleasure? You know, am I giving up all my possessions and going to like a monastery, for instance? So that's not renunciation. Renunciation doesn't matter how much you own, doesn't matter your possessions. Renunciation is a mind that doesn't cling to samsaric pleasure as if it was happiness. Okay. Renunciation is a mind that wants to be free from suffering and achieve escape from samsara. So often, you know, in contemporary self-help circles, they talk about self-compassion. You know, they talk about you have to have compassion for yourself before you can have compassion for others. I don't know if that's entirely true, but when I think of self-compassion, I think of renunciation. So compassion is the wish for others to be free from suffering and all the causes of suffering. So the wish for myself to be free from suffering and the causes of suffering is renunciation. Okay, and what that means is I'm not attached to the perfections of nirvana. Excuse me, the perfections of samsara. We call it the perfections of samsara. So all the pleasures of this life. It's like an ironic name, right? They're not really perfections. And so the way we can develop a mind of renunciation, well, first, when we think about renunciation, one of the great stories that we hear is of Dromtonpa. So Dromtonpa was the heart disciple of Atisha when Atisha came to Tibet. He was a lay person. He had a wife. He had a family. He never ordained. And yet he was Atisha had 3 root disciples, and he was like the heart of the 3. And there's a great story. He founded a few monasteries, and he was visiting one of these monasteries that he had founded, and he saw an old monk. And so he was highly respected as a Buddhist teacher, right? And this old monk was meditating. He saw this monk meditating. He said, "Oh, it's very nice that you're meditating. Wouldn't it be better to practice Dharma?" So the monk was very confused. He said, what does he mean? I thought I was practicing Dharma. And so then he said, well, he must mean that I should circumambulate holy objects. So he started doing, circumambulations. And the next day, Dromtonpa saw him, and he's like, oh, that's very wonderful. You're circumambulating holy objects. Wouldn't it be better to practice Dharma? And so now he's very confused. So I don't know what he's talking about. Maybe he means I should be reciting scriptures. So then he started reciting scriptures. And the next day, Dromtonpa sees him. He says, oh, that's so wonderful. I rejoice in you reciting scriptures. Wouldn't it be better to practice Dharma? So finally, the monk says, I give up. What do you mean? I thought I was practicing Dharma. And Dromtonpa says, to practice Dharma is to renounce this life. That is practicing Dharma. So what does it mean to renounce this life? It means that your motivation should always be on freeing yourself from suffering and on freeing others from suffering. So you can't be attached to this life.
So how did he know that the old monk wasn't?
Well, because Dromtonpa was a realized being, and so he was able to see into the reason the monk was doing. We can't. I can't see anything you do and know your motivation, right? I don't know your mind. But Dromtonpa was, a realized being. And so he saw that this monk was going through the actions that are holy actions on the outside and do accumulate merit, but he still had a mind that was grasping onto this life as being the most important, right? And looking at the benefits that he would accumulate in this life by practicing Dharma.
Well, my question is, so when we go from knowledge to realization, you said this being probably a realized being, that we know about ourselves. How will we know about ourselves?
What do you mean?
So like I know I'm meditating and I've gained some realizations, and that's the way I see the world. But how do I know that others
Okay,
don't see
so-
what I see?
When I say a realized being, I actually mean high levels of meditative realization where you can achieve different types of clairvoyance. So one type of clairvoyance you can achieve is to understand others' minds. Can't remember the term now, but it's a clairvoyance that understands others' minds. You can actually achieve that. It's a worldly type of sitting that you can achieve by having your own high levels of meditative realization. But the point, again, whether this actually happened or not is not as much the point, insofar as a lot of these stories from the times of the Kadapa Geshes and so forth, right? We have all these stories that come from this time. The point is to recognize that our external actions are not an indication of a spiritual practice. A spiritual practice is marked by renouncing this life. And what that means is not simply giving up your possessions and becoming a monk or nun, not simply avoiding worldly pleasure, but it's not attaching meaning to worldly pleasure that isn't there. Not looking at anything in samsara and saying, this is happiness. So we experience the samsara and its ups and its downs, it ebbs and flows, and we can appreciate those comfortable or pleasurable experiences, but we don't ascribe meaning to them that isn't there. We don't say these are real happiness, right? And so to renounce samsara is what we mean by that. The term for renunciation in Tibetan is Neju Gyusampa. That means definite emergence. It's a mind that definitely emerges out of samsara, rises above samsara. That's the actual term. Tibetans have this way of etymologizing their terms. So they take a Sanskrit term, and when they translate it into Tibetan, a lot of them are like, they take what they see as the real meaning of the term and then translate that. So Ne Jungi Sampa, a mind of definite emergence. We translate it as renunciation, but that's what it means. A mind that is raising itself out of samsara. Okay.
What's the sense?
I actually don't know. I was just thinking about that today this morning. I don't know. Oh, okay.
That's Pali?
Not sure.
That's Sanskrit.
Nisarana?
I can look it up and let you guys know. I don't know off the top of my head, but I'll look it up. But usually, yeah, no, I don't want to. Even if you look at the words, like for instance, the Sanskrit word for nirvana, right? Ni is a prefix that means ending, and it has to do with cutting or the ending of something. But in Tibetan, the word that is translated from nirvana is nyanyan depa, which means moving beyond suffering. If you translate it word for word, nyanyan is sorrow or difficult circumstances, le depa, moving beyond those. So they translate the Sanskrit word of nirvana, a cutting off, as moving beyond suffering, right? So the Tibetans look at the meaning, and that's how they translate it. So for renunciation, we mean definitely emerging out of of suffering, of samsara. So this is not about giving up happiness. It's not about denying pleasure. It's a mental process. It's not a physical process. You can give up all of your possessions and not have any renunciation at all if you still cling to them, right? If you have mental clinging to those things, then you're not renounced. It has nothing to do with what you do or don't own. And so the way we think about this is we often think about, we can talk about this 6 general characteristics of samsara that make it unreliable, right? And that can help us develop renunciation. So the first one is the fact that samsara is uncertain. There's nothing guaranteed in samsara. You might have pleasurable experiences one day, and then an hour later have incredibly difficult, painful experiences. There's no guarantee how things are going to happen. You can make the best plans in the world, and none of them will come to fruition. Because nothing about samsara is guaranteed. There's no certainty within samsara. That's the first general characteristic of samsara. And the next is that samsara itself is in the very nature of dissatisfaction. There's nothing in samsara that can be real satisfaction, because it's always temporary, it's always ending, and it's always just a transformation from one type of difficulty to a different. So the very nature of samsara is dissatisfaction. All of the perfections or pleasures of samsara have as their nature dissatisfaction. And you can think about that in an easy way, and this goes back to the suffering of change. Think of something that is incredibly pleasurable, like having a delicious meal, right? A 5-star Michelin meal. It's so wonderful. But if you keep eating that meal, then you're just going to become sick, right? That's not real happiness. That's not satisfaction. And even if you know an appropriate amount to eat, so you don't feel sick, it's only provided satisfaction for a very short period of time. And then it's gone. You might have good memories of it, you can recollect it, but that satisfaction was nothing but, a blip. That's not real satisfaction. The very nature of samsara is dissatisfaction, which isn't to say we can't have pleasurable things, but we can't cling to those pleasures as if they were real, everlasting, permanent pleasure or happiness. That makes us more grateful for the things we do have. When we think of all the difficulties we could be experiencing, when we have some small moment of pleasure, even if we say this isn't real, permanent happiness, this small moment, I can be so much more grateful for it. And in the moment, say, I have this pleasurable moment right now. I can enjoy this for this moment, because there's no guarantee that this pleasure I'm experiencing is going to continue for more than this moment. No one promised me happiness in this life, right? So if I have this moment now, I can enjoy it. And then when it goes away, I've let it go. I'm not clinging to this. Another of the 6 characteristics of samsara is that samsara is marked by having to leave our body again and again. So we're constantly dying over and over again. And then the next one that goes with that is we take birth over and over again. And this process of dying and then taking birth is traumatic, It's not like a fun process. And there are different ways we talk about the bardo, So the intermediate state being, but none of that process, for those of us who don't have really highly realized minds, is pleasurable. It's very disorienting, right? Having to over and over again die and take birth. Especially because we lose so much of our practice, right? Now, as we were saying earlier, we create imprints in this life. We create habits, familiarities that come with us to our future lives. And so the more we study and practice in this life, in our next life, those levels of understanding and realization will be much easier because we've planted so many seeds. We've become so familiar with it, right? So even if through the process of dying and then being reborn, we forget whatever it is we've studied, it's so much easier to access it. When we say even the fact that we are all here together studying Dharma as a group means that in past lives, we've created some karmic relationship to each other and we engage in the study of Dharma together in past lives. And that's why that connection, that spiritual seed is ripening in our experience right? But we've had to go through the samsaric experience of dying and then being reborn in order to experience that ripening. So those are the third and fourth characteristics of samsara that make us want to renounce samsara. And then samsara is a state of constantly going from high to low, right? The way it's talked about is that we may have a really prosperous rebirth in one life and the next one fall really low. We can see this even in our everyday lives, that you go from highs to lows almost indiscriminately, right? Both emotional and in terms of your resources or things like this. That there's no stability in samsara, is what it's getting at, right? So not only is samsara marked by uncertainty, that you can't guarantee what's going to happen, and not only is it marked by being dissatisfaction or dissatisfactory, and a state where you constantly have to cycle between dying and then being reborn, but in that samsara, there is no stability. There's no guarantee that when you have a positive environment or condition, you can keep that, right? One life to the next, or even in any given life. And then lastly, that samsara itself has the characteristic of being, anyone who is a samsaric being has the characteristic of being without a helper. And what that means is no one can do the work for you to free you from samsara. So we have this characteristic of being on our own in that way. Now, we obviously have a community of people that teach us the Dharma and help us practice the Dharma, and also friends and family that are loving for us, whether they're part of our Dharma practice or not. So when we say that we have, that samsara has the characteristic of being without a helper, that isn't to say we don't have assistance in this life, but ultimately, no one can free us from samsara except for ourselves, right? The Buddhas can't free us from samsara. If they could, none of us would be suffering. Because they are infinite compassion. They don't want us to suffer. All the Buddhas can do is teach us how to free ourselves from samsara, which you could say is a helper, right? But the meaning of this is that they can't do the work for us. So as the nature of being a samsaric being is that you are without a helper, which means you have to do the work on your own. So if we think about these 6 points that help us develop a mind of renunciation, it helps us develop a mind that says there is no ultimate happiness in samsara, and therefore I won't cling to suffering as if it were real happiness. I'll have a mind focused on being free from suffering. So I'll develop real compassion for myself. Compassion that says I really want to be free from suffering and all the causes of suffering. And due to that, I will engage in activities that propel me towards Buddhahood. The story that I always tell about the fickle nature of samsara, which I'm sure many of you have heard, but I'll tell again, is about, actually, I'm going to read the original story. So this story, I think the way most of our teachers tell it comes from Choe Khor Sum and his commentary on the Lamrim called Liberation in the Palm of Your Hands. But when I was researching, a couple of years ago, I was teaching a class on karma, and I found that there's an actual sutra where this story is told. And Choe Khor Rinpoche's version is a little bit different. So I'm going to read the actual sutra, and then we can talk about it. So the sutra is called, so the sutra being an actual discourse, a teaching of the Buddha. And it is called the Karma Vedanta. So the exposition of karma. And it's translated into English on the 84,000 website, you can get it. And in this text, there's a point where so they're talking about different types of karma. And the place the story comes up in is they're talking about how it's possible to have how do you say, exhausted your lifespan, but not exhausted a particular karmic seed, right? So just because you're experiencing the ripening of a karmic seed, your lifespan may end before that karmic seed has finished ripening. So you experience that one karmic seed over and over again in multiple lifetimes. And this is a story that was taught to make that point. So usually in liberation and in almost every other place I've seen this story told, it's taught that Shariputra is the main person involved. But in this sutra, it's Madhvalayana. So he is Shariputra's kind of counterpoint, right? We call him, in Tibetan, they say Sharipu is Shariputra, and then Margipu is Madhvalayana. But so the sutra says, so he's talking about how it's possible to have exhausted your lifespan, but not yet exhausted a particular karmic seed. And it says, or for example, when the venerable Madhvalayana was wandering through the country of Magadha, collecting alms, he entered a house in which a householder sat together with his wife, holding their son in his lap. They were eating a meal of fish, while in front of them sat a dog, to whom they tossed the fish bones. Then when the householder saw Madhvalayana, he said to him, friend, nobody here gives alms to beggars, go away. And Madhvalayana turned around. At the door of that house, there was a man sitting all the while, and he had come from another country, and he knew that the elder Madhvalayana. When he saw what happened, he was amazed, and he said, oh dear, this venerable monk is the foremost among those possessing magical powers. He has tamed the king of Nagas, Nanda and Upananda. He has shook the divine palace of Vajrayanta with his left toe, and through that the king of the gods, Indra, marveled. He has traversed the whole realm of the great Trichiliacosm in the blink of an eye. These things being so, it is astounding that he was sent away from having been offered alms. Then the elder Madhvalayana, to instill in him a sense of weariness of samsara, he said, my dear, that is not so very astonishing. Well, what then is astonishing? The man asked. He replied, the householder here, eating fish curry is astonishing. That fish was his father, who would frequently scoop out and eat fish from the pond behind the house that carried a lot of fish. Then he died and he was reborn as this very fish. His son too frequently scooped out and ate that fish many hundreds of times, and he too was reborn in that same spot many hundreds of times, again and again and again. This female dog here was the householder's mother. She was overpowered by greed. She never made any offerings to anybody. She never safeguarded her ethical conduct, but instead meanly hoarded all of her possessions for the sake of the family lineage. And so she died with her thoughts attached to the same house, and she was reborn as that female dog. And then after she died, she was reborn again and again in the same place, as a dog that circles this house on the outside for the whole night, afraid that anyone might enter. The son, sitting in the lap of that man, was the wife's lover. When the householder had found out that his wife was sleeping with another man, he pretended he had to go to another city. As soon as he left, the woman slept with the other man, but her husband returned home and killed him. Because he was attached to and attracted to that woman, he was reborn in her womb. See, my dear, the meat they eat is their father's meat. The one to whom they toss the fish bones is the mother. The enemy, the adulterer, the one they killed in a rage. They cradle him in their lap. Therefore, it is only reasonable to feel disgust for the faults of samsara, because this is truly astounding. Then the monk Madhvalayana recited a verse to instill a sense of weariness with samsara in the many people of the Western regions. With a consciousness that is obscured by delusion and desire, he eats his father's meat, he tosses his mother's bones, and he nourishes his wife's lover.
It's dramatic.
It's very dramatic. Now, the way that they often tell that verse is a little bit different. The way you see it in Liberation in the Palm of Your Hand is he eats his father's flesh and he kicks his mother. The enemy he killed, he coddles on his lap, and the wife gnaws on her husband's bones. Samsara can be such a farce. That's another version of condensing that same story, right? So that's showing that nothing in samsara is certain, right? And I know that's like a cute story, or what it seems, right? But so in the context of that sutra, it was specifically showing how the father was reborn as a fish over and over and over again, because he had created that karma of killing many fish. And so it wasn't like he was reborn as a fish one time and the son happened to catch him. But that karma that he created hadn't been exhausted in the lifetime of one fish. So it happened over and over again. And the same thing with the mother being reborn as the dog that guarded the house. that karma was so strong. When that one dog died, he was again reborn as a dog guarding the house because the karma had not exhausted, even though that lifespan had exhausted. So that's the context of that teaching. But what we take from it, and what Mangalam says, is to instill a weariness of samsara, which I like. The idea that samsara is a farce is also nice. But we want a weariness in samsara. We want to realize that we need to be free from this suffering. We can't grasp onto it as if it were meaningful or happy or happiness, you know? So we take our perfect human rebirth and meditate on that to realize how incredibly valuable our opportunities are, what privileges we have. Then we meditate on death and impermanence to instill in us the motivation that we should practice now. There's no reason to delay. And then we want to know, how do we practice? Where do we put our effort? Our effort is looking at actually what's causing us suffering, which is the fact that we're samsaric beings. So we don't want to develop a mind that wishes only for worldly happiness, but one that is disgusted with the pleasures of samsara, isn't attached to them, doesn't hold on to them as meaningful, and instead wants to liberate ourselves from samsara. Now we know the best way to be free from samsara is to help others, right? That is why we need to have the bodhicitta motivation. But renunciation is a critical component. So I think of it as self-compassion, but I also think it is a critical way of engaging in everything we do, saying that whenever I experience a moment of pleasure, I can appreciate that pleasure without saying this is real happiness.
It's attention on my fridge, which I get from fridge is full of attention. Renunciation. Takes the pain out of it.
Yeah, that's true, right? So
Self-sacrifice.
Yeah.
Because you're putting something aside for something else, which is, you know.
that's true. But at the same time, so the idea of renunciation is renouncing something to get something better in exchange. But above and beyond that, so that's true for worldly renunciation as well, right? That's true for just the idea of accepting, giving up something now to have a better reward in the future. That can be taken in a very worldly sense or a spiritual sense. We say that's true, but more importantly, what we're giving up isn't actually happiness. What we're giving up is suffering, right? So on top of that, that you're giving up something to exchange to get a better result, that's true. But what we're giving up is also not happiness. We're giving up suffering that we just label as happiness. So in the spiritual sense, it's even more, right? But that is a good example, though, of how we can take this spiritual teaching of renunciation and apply it to our everyday experience and realize that there may be things that we can give up now to earn a better reward in the future in a worldly sense. And that can be a way that we take our spiritual understanding of renunciation and apply it to our everyday lives and have comfort in that, to say I have to make sacrifices now in order to achieve something else. We often talk about that with regard to the practice of patience, right? Patience is not responding to difficult circumstances with frustration and so forth, and being having patience in the face of harm. And so we talk about attending a Dharma session where like you're sitting uncomfortably placed for a few hours, like you're willing to sacrifice that comfort to study the Dharma, right? You're willing to go out of your way to give up your Sunday morning to come study the Dharma with people. So you're giving up this freedom of like sleeping late or doing whatever, you can go in a brunch or these things to then instead engage in a spiritual practice. So you're giving up some temporary immediate happiness because your goal is a bigger picture happiness, right? So often we use that discussion with conversations of patience, practicing patience. So as we want to develop a freedom from samsara, we want to renounce all of the pleasures of samsara as not being real pleasure. I don't think I have time to do this topic. I wanted to talk about karma, but we only have about 10 minutes. So maybe we'll just do questions and answers, and I'll leave karma for next week, okay? Because it's a big topic. Yeah, go ahead.
In order to break into the practice, so we have to practice like we have to take some situation and practice that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Renunciation, for example, today I find some difficult situation and I get anger, but I'm not showing off, but I'm trying to avoid that, so that it's a kind of practice I'm doing, so that I'm trying to calm myself. Like this, we have many situations in a day, right? So likewise, for some happiness, some situation where I need to be, I can enjoy, but I want to practice in Dharma. So is it like a building up, like doing multiple time practices, or it's
So our practice is something that continually strengthens, right? And so one of the things I advocate for and I suggest is every day, at the end of the day, spend some time meditating where you review what you did through that day, right? Review what actions you did that were particularly virtuous, which ones were motivated by afflicted mind. And so if you had a moment of anger in the day, you say, what caused me to be angry today? And then you say, did that anger benefit me in any way? And then what could I do in response? Instead of developing anger, what could I do that would counter that anger, right? Once you develop a confidence that that anger is non-beneficial and is only harmful, and that we'll talk a little bit more when we talk about karma, but once you develop that, then you see, okay, well, this is the circumstance that caused me to be angry, or that the anger came from me, but this is the circumstances that precipitated my experience of anger. So when you see that in your meditation, then you can be aware of it. And then maybe the next time you're in that same circumstance, before the anger overwhelms you and causes you to act in a harmful way, you notice it and you can apply an antidote, right? So it's not like overnight, just by studying this, you can get rid of your anger or your desire. Instead, what you're doing is noticing your own habitual patterns and finding ways to break the unhealthy patterns and replace them with healthy patterns, with healthy habits, okay? And that means you have to look at your own experiences. And so I know for me, when I first started studying Buddhism, when I was 18, I was like a very angry teenager. And I was cynical, I was angry. And as I practiced, it's not that my anger just went away, but I became aware of when that anger was manifest. And then I was able to hold it back. And then I started realizing, so then before that anger came, I started to be able to see, oh, this is going to cause me to be angry. Traditionally, this would cause me to be angry. So then at first, it's just being aware you're angry. Because, sometimes we get angry at something and we'll lash out before we even realize that we're acting out of anger. Like we're not even aware of how overwhelmed we are by our own afflicted minds. So at first, just developing a realization in the moment of, oh, wait, I'm acting out of anger right now. That is a huge revelation. And then as you do it more, you start to notice it earlier, and earlier. So then you can nip it in the bud before it gets too big, right? So that's all part of a spiritual practice. A spiritual practice isn't to say you're going to be a Buddha tomorrow. A spiritual practice is to say I'm moving in the right direction, one baby step at a time, The reason that my family was so, all of my family was so comfortable with me eventually becoming a monk and moving to India is because they saw, none of them practiced Buddhism, but they saw that my practice of Buddhism, which they didn't even know anything about, right? Because I was away at school, then they came back, they just saw you are a different person. You're not as angry, you're calmer. Like you are able to attend to other people in a more meaningful way, right? So they could see that. And that didn't happen overnight. It happened through years of my practice, and I'm still getting angry all the time, but I'm better at noticing that anger before I let it get out of control. And so, and I'm still not perfect at it. I still lash out, but I'm better than I was through my practice. And hopefully every day I get a little bit better. And the same thing when you act out of desire, when you see something and you say, oh, I really need that thing. That thing's going to make me happy, right? So that is the practice, is a constant evolution of looking at our lives and seeing what harmful habits and routines we've created in this life, as well as we say in all past lives, and replacing them with healthy habits.
So there is one part of group, they always say that suppressing emotion is not good. So whatever, if you want to cry, you can cry. Don't suppress. So how do you see this?
So when we talk about suppressing our emotions, what we say is, if all you're doing is pretending they aren't there, then that's not solving the problem, right? So what do we mean by suppressing our emotion? I don't want to suppress my anger. I don't want to experience anger. So I want to apply an antidote that gets rid of that anger. But to just be like, I'm not angry or I'm not sad, to try to ignore it, that's what we're saying is harmful. And many times they say that's what you have to do, right? Pretend you're not really angry, or pretend you don't have sadness. And so there's different types of emotions. Right now, talking about anger and talking about sadness are wildly different. So if you're experiencing sadness, whether that be from a quote unquote like valid reason or not. So if you experience, we all have moments in our life where like sadness is an appropriate response. right? When people are harmful to us or people we care about die or we experience trauma or grief in some way, that's like an appropriate human response. So instead of trying to pretend I'm not really sad right now, then you look at your emotional response and say, where is this emotion coming from? And you say, how can I experience this emotion, but let this experience move me towards liberation, right? So like, you know, one of the reasons that I found Buddhism was because a good friend of mine died. And I realized that I didn't have any way to understand my grief, that I was so upset about his dying, but I didn't have any way to understand that because I didn't believe in the faith tradition that I had come up with. And so I thought I didn't believe in religion at all at that point. I thought it was all man-made systems of control, you know. But so then I experienced this grief and it overwhelmed me because I said, I don't know how to process this. So Buddhism isn't saying then, when I found Buddhism, it wasn't saying, you're not really sad. That sadness is an illusion. No, it's saying that being sad that someone died is an appropriate response. It's a human response. But wallowing in that and saying this sadness now defines me is not helpful. So experience the sadness or whatever the emotion be, recognize it, then see where it came from and see what you need to do to not let that overwhelm your life and your experience. But you're not ignoring it. You're not saying, I'm not dealing with this. Now, I will say, as like a practical sense, sometimes in a world, if you speak to a therapist, sometimes you have to compartmentalize in order to deal with the world. So, as many of you know, my mother recently died, and I spent many weeks taking care of her. She had stage 4 cancer, and I was able to go home from the monastery 3 times for 5 or 6 weeks at a time and be with her while she died. And, you know, I have 2 siblings, and the 3 of us had a hard time growing up. Like I have a lot of issues with our mother and all different kind of emotional trauma and difficult situations growing up. And then as my mother was progressing with her cancer metastasized to her brain. And so she started acting really hateful and spiteful and disjointed with reality. And the only way my sister and I could take care of her was to compartmentalize that experiences of our grief and our own trauma that we needed to process as human beings. But we said, we can't deal with this right now. Because right now, taking care of her the best we can, making her life the end of her life as comfortable and peaceful as we can, that's what our focus has to be. So these emotions that we're feeling, emotions of grief and sorrow and of anger at, you know, the way that she kind of harmed us with past trauma, this is not the time or place for us to process them. So we had to compartmentalize. And that is not a healthy long-term strategy. But in the short term, that allowed us to be fully present with her, to do what she needed. And then when our situation changed, then we went back and addressed it. So sometimes you do have to just put things to the side and say, I'm not in a place where I can deal with this right now. I'm not ignoring it, but I'm saying that I will come to this when I have more resources available, whether that be physical resources or emotional resources, right? But so our emotions are all valid. We have to deal with them in a way that's meaningful, that is not ignoring them, but is not letting them overwhelm our lives. And so in the short term, that might mean having to compartmentalize to focus on one thing or another, but eventually we have to come back to it. In the same way, there's a big thing these days about the way you deal with anger is by getting it out. So screaming into a pillow, or now you can go to anger rooms where they just give you like a pair of goggles and a baseball bat and you get to like break plates and break glass, you know, and be destructive. And there's this idea that doing that can help release you of your anger. And we say all that's doing is creating the habit of indulging in anger. Like it's making your anger more powerful. So in the moment, it may feel very cathartic, but you're creating a habit of indulging anger instead of preventing it. So we don't find that psychologically useful. But again, you're not suppressing it and you're not indulging it. You're looking at it directly, saying, where did this come from? And what do I need to do to prevent this from arising again? And how do I deal with it in a healthy way? Any other questions we want to go through? I think this isn't plugged in, just so you know. This is about the battery on this is about to go. It beeped at us. The technology, it's always beeping to let us know how it feels. So there we go. So again, today, as we're discussing the introduction of Buddhist meditation and philosophy, we talk more about the Lamrim and the beginning stages of it, focusing on perfect human rebirth death and impermanence, and renunciation. And so those are all practices that are shared in common with the small scope and the middle scope. Renunciation and understanding karma. Well, karma goes with the small scope, renunciation goes with the middle scope. We're a little bit out of order. So I wanted to do renunciation first. And then we'll do karma next week. So are there any questions before we close for the day? I will not be. Venerable Kelvin will be next week, and I think it actually will be online. So the plan is next week, Venerable Kelvin will be teaching, and then there'll be a 3-week break from teachings because we have exams. It's a very stressful time at the monastery right now. We have our debate exams, and then 2 weeks after that, our written exams. And then as soon as those exams are done, then teaching sessions will start back up, and there'll be 4 more weeks of continual teachings. And I'll do 2, and Venerable Kelvin will do 2. And I think of those 4, 3 of them will be in person and 1 online. So that should all be on the CKSL calendar website. Let's finish. Just go. Come one moment, D. We're gonna do closing prayers first. Sorry, that was Tibetan. Teskoa means like just wait a minute. Karmakik teskoa. Wait a minute. Hold on. Karma. It's funny, in Tibetan, the word karma means a moment. Karmakik, 1 moment. It's spelled differently than the Tibetan karma. In Sanskrit, the word Sanskrit, karma, right? It comes from the verbal root kar, which means to do or to act. And so kartar is an actor, and karma is an action done. So that's what karma comes from. In Tibetan, we say le. So le is his work or action, you know. And so even if you go to the office, that's like a leka, or you do work every day, leka, that's just the work you do. Le itself is karma, but it's also an action. That's why some translations you get very confusing because you're like, what are you talking about? Like the negative actions versus negative karma, but it's the same word, you know. So you look at the etymology, it makes a little more sense, which this is to say that it has more than one meaning. So part of engaging in these texts and the reason we study like this is to realize that one word means more than one thing at the same time, or it can. And so we have to find out how to incorporate all those meanings into our practice. Okay, so it's a whole different topic. Let us try to close our practice by making our practice virtuous in the end. So it's ideal, any practice we adopt, try to make it virtuous in the 3 times. So it's virtuous in the beginning by setting a strong motivation that we're here today to help others. So we set that motivation in the beginning. That makes our virtuous practice in the beginning. That makes our practice virtuous in the beginning. And we make our practice virtuous in the middle by actually engaging in study, contemplation, meditation. And virtuous in the end by recognizing that through our activity, we've accumulated some positive karma. And instead of keeping that for ourselves, we dedicate that karma with the wish that that karma, that positive karma, that merit, may ripen on other sentient beings. That other sentient beings might experience happiness because of our virtuous activities today, and that our virtuous activities may propel us to Buddhahood more quickly. Because as a Buddha, we will have the greatest capacity to be of service to others. And so we dedicate our merit in that way. And that makes our practice virtuous in 3 times. And so we will recite very brief dedication prayers on page 36. The 2 verses of a dedication prayer, as well as the long life prayer for His Holiness the Dalai Lama. Due to the merits of these virtuous actions, may I quickly attain the state of a Guru Buddha and lead all living beings without exception into that enlightened state. May the supreme jewel of Bodhicitta that has not arisen arise and grow, and may that which has arisen not diminish but increase more and more. In the land encircled by snow mountains, you are the source of all happiness and good, all powerful Chenrezig Tenzin Gyatso. Please remain until samsara ends. Great. Thank you so much for spending some time with me this morning. I appreciate it.
Thank you. Everybody for coming and teaching us, especially when you have exams coming up. And we hope you do well. We hope all our teachers do well in the exams.
Thank you.
And see you all next week online.
And please join and please participate also, because online sometimes try and we'll be there to help you if you cannot get on.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.